It is a good day to be a Democrat. Don't know about tomorrow or the day after, but today's pretty good. So let us enjoy that for a moment. We'll go over the election loss by Elon in Wisconsin and the large Democratic overperformance in Florida. We'll talk about what each of them mean. We'll talk about Cory Booker's impressive physical and spiritual feat in talking for 25 hours straight and holding the Senate floor. Also, the latest deportation scandal has me wondering just how empty inside you would have to be to behave like the current vice president of the United States. And yes, we've seen the talk about Trump wanting like leaning a little more into his trolling about running for a third term. So we're going to talk about whether you should take it seriously or not. And at least this I can promise, we're going to help you feel a little better about it, or at least less worried. Welcome back to the podcast for the 54% of Americans who regularly vote for progress in every election and want to convince their friends and family members to join our majority. This is Majority 54. Now, this is the part where you would usually hear Ravi's voice, but his book tour is going so well right now that he can't join us today. Thanks, by the way, to the folks who came out in St. Louis the other night. And by the way, Left Bank Books, where we did that event for Ravi's book, still has signed copies of his novel, Garbage Town, and you can order from them. They can even ship it anywhere in the country. Now, in the past, when either Ravi or I can't join, we get a guest co-host. But I am so inspired by my friend Cory Booker holding the floor of the Senate for 25 straight hours that I've decided to find out if I can hold your attention for the next 45 minutes. So here I go with the Tom Hanks castaway version of the show. All right, so let's start with these election results in Wisconsin. As you know, Susan Crawford was running as they don't really run on partisan tickets per se, but everybody knows who the liberal and the conservative is. So she was running as the liberal candidate for the Supreme Court of Wisconsin. And this race was going to determine whether there was a 5-4 majority in the Republican direction or in the Democratic direction. And thankfully, she won. And she won by, if I recall correctly, like 11 points, maybe, or 9 points. I can't remember. But anyway, let's check out her victory speech.
Happy birthday. I know how glad you are to see the TV ads end. So today, Wisconsinites fended off an unprecedented attack on our democracy. That's right. Our fair elections and our Supreme Court. And Wisconsins stood up and said loudly that justice does not have a price. Our courts are not for sale.
Now, I remember a day when we wouldn't have to pay super close attention to things like a race for the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin. So let's acknowledge for a moment that when we have to worry about that kind of thing, a couple of things are happening. One, we live in a world, in a country that is so polarized, but also on such a razor thin margin that this sort of thing can swing elections, including presidential elections. So who ends up on the Supreme Court in a state like Wisconsin, which is constantly one of the states that can determine an election, that can really affect who wins a presidential election. So now we have to worry about those kinds of things. As my friend Jason Sudeikis once famously said on this show during the first Trump administration, he said, "I hate that I know more, that I have to follow politics so closely now that I know more names of the Trump administration than I did of the Bartlett administration when I watched West Wing." So that is a shame that we have to follow things so closely. But on the other hand, it does sort of require us to be civically engaged at a sort of supernatural level. But the other thing about this is that it also means that we are in a place where the Republicans control the House, the Senate, the White House, and the Supreme Court of the United States, to where we are kind of looking for indicators of momentum. And it is clear to me that this is a real indicator of momentum. Not only did she win by quite a bit, she won in the face of massive spending by Elon Musk, who was literally telling people, before we even get to Musk, here where Elon held that last rally, where he, I think gave like $1 million check to somebody who voted to show. I mean, like that's one piece. He was like literally giving out millions of dollars to people for voting. But in that county, which Trump won by 8 points, and Elon held a big rally there at the end, she won that county, as pointed out here by Dave Weigel in this tweet that we have up. That is a big deal. That is an actual indicator of momentum. I remember when I was once campaigning for, I think I was campaigning for Tammy Baldwin several years ago in Wisconsin, and a member of Congress, Mark Takano, I can't remember his name, but I was talking to him, Democratic member of Congress, during that visit, and I was Jeremy says Mark Takano is my guy. He's in Wisconsin, right? I can appropriately credit him with this. I can't remember. Anyway, California. So it's not him. I don't know. Really not, shout out to this really nice member of Congress who said this to me, whose name I've forgotten. He said that I was referring to Wisconsin as a purple state. I was saying, Missouri used to be a purple state. And he said, Wisconsin is not really a purple state. He said, it's not a blue state and it's not a red state. He said, it is a blue state and it is a red state. It just depends on the year, but it's never really purple. Some years it's red and some years it's blue. And I think that is right. And it all tends to have to do with turnout in Wisconsin. So, we can also temper our enthusiasm a little by remembering this sort of odd turn of events that's happened now, where for many years, for my whole upbringing as a young person in politics to a middle-aged person now, one of the basic pieces of political physics that I understood was that higher turnout elections were good for Democrats and lower turnout elections were bad for Democrats. And the reason for that was that lower income voters, working class voters, tended to vote Democratic. And as a result, it was harder for them to get off work. Their lives did not lend themselves to being able to constantly, to go, show up, stand in line, vote, that kind of thing. And so that's why we used to do a lot better in presidential years than in midterms. So, for instance, I was elected Secretary of State of Missouri in 2012. In 2010, it was a terrible year for Democrats, and in 2014, it was a terrible year for Democrats. And Obama lost Missouri in 2012, but the virtue of the presidential election was you got a higher turnout. This is not just a midterm; it's beyond this. This is a special election. And yet it looks like it lends itself more toward Democrats in this situation because of the way turnout works. Now, that also, I think part of that is that when you are the party in power and you're happy about being in power, you're less motivated to go to the polls, i.e. the Republicans in this case, and defend what you have. Because it seems that maybe this was always the case, I don't know, but it seems in our modern political sort of environment that we're in, and this is a little bit sad, but what drives people to the polls more than anything is wanting the other side to lose / anger, outrage, that kind of thing. And there's clearly not as much outrage on the right now because they feel like they're running stuff, and because they are running stuff. But there's a lot of fear and outrage and desire to see the other side lose, particularly Elon Musk, frankly, on the left. And I think that played into this. So I say all that to say there is clearly some momentum. If you look at what happened in Florida, we did not win those seats in Florida in this special election that just happened, but Gabe Alamont overperformed Harris's margin by about 23 points in Florida 1. That's a Trump plus 37 district. Josh Weil overperformed Harris's margin by about 16 points in Florida 6, which was a Trump plus 30 district. And that's why, in this Adam Carlson tweet, he says, it's pretty clear why Elise Stefanik had to pull her nomination for UN ambassador. She's in a Trump plus 21 district, meaning there was a chance that district in a special election was going to go, and now you got the margin getting closer and closer. There is reason to be excited about that kind of thing, and it does demonstrate momentum. And if you think about, the special elections that we had between the Trump election in 2016 and Biden getting elected in 2020, we were repeatedly winning those special elections or overperforming in those special elections. Look at a couple of times John Ossoff, and then he ends up as a senator. So, that is a positive indicator, no doubt. You would way rather have this than have it be that we were just having whatever the Trump positive number was, however much Trump won by in those districts, that it tracked exactly. You would not want that. And that would be reflective of what we see right now with the low popularity numbers of the Democratic Party and that sort of thing. That's not happening, and that's really good. But you also have to temper that enthusiasm a little bit and understand that some function of that is a combination of some people saying, well, I really don't want one party to be in total power all the time. Some of those more independent voters, swing voters who go back and forth, I often feel like sometimes they're just voting for the party out of power. But I think that the larger factor is, you're going to have enthusiasm in a situation where Democrats, I mean, you're watching or listening to this right now because you want some sense of reassurance. But what you want more than anything right now is you want a sense of agency. And if you are in one of these places, a state like Wisconsin, or if you are in a district like the ones in Florida, you, for a moment in time, have a feeling of agency. At least you can go vote against these dudes. And very few people are missing the opportunity to do that. I think overall that bodes really well. But what I don't think we should do is read into that to say that this is like a shock moment in time poll that means that a lot of people who voted for Trump last time wouldn't vote for him if they had it to do over again, or won't vote for a Republican in the midterms. It doesn't necessarily mean that. It definitely is an indicator of enthusiasm, and that is a good thing. But let's not read too much into it at the same time. One comment before I get into talking about Cory Booker, which we're definitely going to do, because it leans into why today is a good day for Democrats and why we're sort of feeling ourselves right now. Before we do that, can we talk for a minute about how crazy it actually is to elect judges to a state Supreme Court? The whole concept of particularly appellate judges is that they are beholden to the law and not to anything else. Now, when you run for office, like a statewide office, you have to raise money. You become beholden to people who could come before you. You become potentially beholden to other politicians who could be litigants. I mean, when I was the Missouri Secretary of State, anytime you sued the state over anything having to do with ballot language, anything having to do with securities regulation, anything having to do with business registration, you had to sue Jason Kander, which meant, people were representing me in front of the Missouri State Supreme Court all the time. And if they got to the Missouri Supreme Court either by beating somebody I endorsed or with the strength of my endorsement, I feel like that would have kind of messed up the system, right? Let alone if they got there because of financial contributions by donors who have big businesses in the state that are very likely to appear before them. I'm glad that for all of the things in Missouri that do feel backward politically all the time, we have maintained what we started in the first place, which was the nonpartisan court system and the way it works. And this is in a lot of states still, thankfully. Now, the Republicans want to get rid of this. But in a lot of states, it still works this way, where there's a commission of lawyers who choose, and this is for trial. In Missouri, this is for trial judges in the big counties, and it's for appellate judges of all types, and it's for all state Supreme Court judges. They pick three judges, three potential people to be judges. They send those people, and it's a nonpartisan commission, and they send those people to the governor, and the governor has to pick one of those. If they don't, they can send it back. They can get a new panel. And if over time, if they don't pick them, eventually the commission gets to pick for them. Now, what this is not is a non-political system. The people who become judges, at some point or another, they have become political in some regard. But what they usually have not been is very partisan, because in order to get through that process, they can't have been extremely partisan actors, and they have to be respected jurists as well. I think that's a much better system. And I just wanted to point out that, like, if we ever really get control of a lot of stuff, we really need to put that everywhere, because it makes me anxious to watch people have to run for judge at a level like Supreme Court. Now, if you're like talking about a small county, it makes sense for the judge to be elected because they're going to know everybody anyway. So that's fine. But I don't like state Supreme Court judges being elected. It bothers me, but that's neither here nor there. Let's talk about my friend Cory Booker, and let's just start by showing this highlight video. Now it's about 3 minutes, but as we go through it, I'm going to tell you which hour of the speech we're in so you can get a sense for what Cory was saying during this 25-hour filibuster. So let's go to this.
I rise with the intention of disrupting the normal business
hour one
of the United States Senate for as long as I am physically able. This would be a crisis for elder care. This would be a crisis for disability services. What it is, when a nation isn't taking care of its elders, it's a crisis of our national character. Why are so many women dying in childbirth and in the postpartum period in America? Shameful. And now,
hour four,
I just found out that the community violence intervention money that you allowed me to fight so hard to get into that bill is being clawed back by Donald Trump. They're writing me letters
hour five
with words like fear and terror. They're talking about staying up at night and not being able to sleep because they don't have a president that comforts them. I mean, it's almost like you can't make this
hour
up,
six.
Honestly. Another story from a Social Security employee
hour
in New Jersey.
9.
I am a claims representative for our Social Security field office. The most dramatic changes I've noticed from our recent change in operations is that our appointment calendar seems to be filling up more quickly for simple post-entitlement changes. We've gone through healthcare cuts. We've gone through Social Security being attacked and undermined and slashed. If you're revoking somebody's visa, make a phone call, tell them that you have 30 days to leave. But there should be due process. You should have to prove your claims in court. If this person is somehow lying with some kind of enemy, prove it. You don't need more tax cuts.
Hour 14.
And we as a society have an obligation to each other, to those farmers, to those rural folks, to the cops I stood with at the funeral of one of their colleagues in Newark 2 weeks ago. Our Social Security offices are being closed already. And the question of why, under the guise of efficiency, but you're hurting our elders who deserve dignity in their retirement. It's stunning to me. I've had farmers from New Jersey to Texas
17.
coming to my office about this president freezing contracts that we approved in a bipartisan manner, putting them in financial crisis. It's not right or left, it's right or wrong. It's not a partisan moment. It's an American moment. It's a moral moment. Does the wealth of our people, we have more billionaires than any other country, does that speak to the greatness of our nation? No. I think the things that speak to the greatness of a nation is how do we take care of each other? I ask you, are you better off than you were 72 days ago economically? I asked that question. Ask it to your friends. Are they better off economically? Well, I don't see how they could be because prices are up. Stock market's down, the risk of recession is climbing, consumer confidence is in the gutter. I want to stand here today and tell you I'm going to do everything I can. I'm willing to go to some lengths. But I am inadequate. You are inadequate. We're senators with all of this power, but in this democracy, the power of the people is greater than the people in power. This is a moral moment that more Americans need to stand up and say enough is enough. Moment where judges rule in his favor. And he praises them. They just don't rule for him. He drags them and threatens them. So much so that Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has to tell them to back up. When elected officials speak up, many of them fear what the consequences would be for them or their reelection if they speak against him.
All right. Pretty impressive. I'm going to break this down, talk about what I think is going on here and talk about Cory sort of in this moment. But first, we played the highlights there, but you may or may not be familiar with sort of the details about what happened. So Cory Booker has just, as of a few hours ago, broken the record for the longest speech ever delivered in the Senate. It's a marathon address, a symbolic protest, really, against President Trump. He warned of a grave and urgent moment in American history, and he went for 25 hours and 4 minutes. So he did this for more than a calendar day. Ask yourself, when's the last time you were even awake that long, let alone standing on your feet and talking? It was not, technically a filibuster, which would be a speech that is meant to just obstruct the passage of a single bill, but it held up legislative business in the Senate, which is Republican controlled. And the rules for speeches like this, they require a speaker to remain standing and forego bathroom breaks. So the previous record was held, a lot of you probably remember this, and this is kind of a delicious irony here, by Republican Senator Strom Thurmond, who back when he was still a Democrat in 1957, he spoke for 24 hours and 18 minutes against the Civil Rights Act. Booker said he would speak for as long as he was physically able. He began around 7 p.m. local time on Monday evening. He concluded around just a little after 8 on Tuesday. Cory is 55 years old. He's the fourth ranking Democrat in the Senate. He felt some of the time, and this is why I think there were some gaps in the highlight video. He spent some of the time reading letters from constituents, talking about how they've been harmed by Trump's policies. He ran out the clock a little bit by discussing sports, reciting poetry, taking questions from colleagues. That part is sort of like if you follow Cory on Instagram, it's just sort of, that's sort of what his Instagram is like sometimes. He talked about his roots, descendant of both slaves and slave owners. So it's pretty impressive. He got some help from other senators who, were Democratic senators who got up and could inquire of him, ask him questions to help him sort of save his voice. But it's not like he got much of a break during that, right? Not a huge break. But it's the longest speech in the Senate since the 21-hour filibuster in 2013 by Ted Cruz, who was working against Obamacare at the time. So, all right, let's talk about why this resonated. I think that the reason that this resonated so much, particularly when you listen to what Cory was saying, is the desperation that so many of us are feeling. And the way that I know that desperation is there is, one, the obvious fact that we are in control of nothing and bad things are happening. That's enough to be able to tell. But as a higher profile person on the left, as in not as high profile as I had been in the past by choice, I'm less high profile, but I guess higher profile than the average, Democratic voter walking around. I do have a perspective into the way the Democratic base is feeling, and that is a feeling that I would sum up with two words, and they would be in all caps, and that is do something. Right? I feel like a lot of you and a lot of us feel like, why is this continuing to happen unabated? Isn't there anybody who can do anything to stop it? And in the absence of, because in the reality here is we don't control anything with regard to the federal government, right? So in that reality, in the absence of the ability to stand up and stop things, what I think Democratic voters and activists and the Democratic faithful want to see is they want to see that you feel the way they feel. They want you to be an avatar for that feeling. They want you to reflect the desperation that they feel. And if you think about Cory's tone during the speech, and you just think about the fact that he chose to do this, to stand and hold the floor for 25 hours, I think it is a very important moment, in that it says to the base, I understand how you're feeling, and I share in that feeling. And I may not be able to make much of a difference, but I can do this. I can stand here and I can hold up business for a little while, and I can show how desperate this situation is, and I can try to give voice to your concerns by talking about them during this time. I do think that is important, and I think it is an important lesson for Democratic politicians to take right now, which is, even if it is symbolic, you have to demonstrate that you understand the desperation of this moment, and you don't minimize the way people feel. I think that's really important. I think it's a big part of why it resonated. I also think it's a good indicator, or it's a good reminder of why Cory in particular is a good messenger for this moment. I have a bit of a personal relationship with Cory. We don't talk all the time, but every few months we tend to text back and forth about things, and he's a really, really good guy. He's an easy guy to remain friends with. I first got to know Cory back in 2016. He came a couple of times to Missouri, campaigned with me. And Cory is a guy who, I would say two things about Cory as a politician that I think are interesting, and and they're counter to one another. One is, Cory is I've known a few people in politics like this, and Cory's the only one who fits into this who's not actually from the Midwest. Um, and it is that Cory is so truly earnest and so genuinely sincere that sometimes he comes across to people as insincere. And I've known other people like this, both in politics and just in life. And Cory's the only one I know who's not from the Midwest. Like I have a buddy who is like this, and when people meet him, they're like, is he for real?" This friend of mine. And what I always say about this person is, yes, he is for real. He's just the most genuinely Midwestern person you'll ever meet. And Cory, despite being from New Jersey, is very much like that. Like I think people sometimes Cory gets misinterpreted as cheesy or insincere. And when you get to know Cory, you realize, no, that's what he's like all the time. He is genuinely interested and earnest and caring. And in the context of politics, sometimes people see that and they think it's a trick. It's not a trick. But the other thing that's interesting about Cory that goes into that is that Cory is also the reason he's like that is that he is unabashedly himself. And my example of that is the first time I ever really got to know Cory was a trip that he made to Missouri to campaign with me. And this was not long after the unrest in Ferguson. And I had been very involved in Ferguson. I started this nonprofit called Ferguson Rebuild, and I knew a lot of people there. I built some really great relationships there. And also, like, let's be honest, when Cory was coming to campaign for me, one of the things that he was coming to do and to help with, in addition to fundraising and stuff like that, was to help uh, engender more enthusiasm in the Black community. So definitely Ferguson was going to be one of our stops. And to Cory's credit, he was like, I want to go to Ferguson, like independent of that. So we went to Ferguson, and some friends of mine in Ferguson own a couple of restaurants there, like some little mom and pop. Shout out to Kathy and Jerome in Ferguson. And one of the restaurants that they had was a barbecue joint. And so we go into this barbecue joint, and Cory, being unabashedly Cory, has all of these older Black women coming up to him and, trying to, and talking to him about the barbecue and how much do you like the barbecue? Here's a picture Cory and I campaigned together in St. Louis. And Cory's a vegan, and he's gone to the middle of the country now to campaign with me. And we're in a barbecue joint, which Cory was not at any point like, I don't want to campaign at a barbecue joint. He was just like, let's do it. And what was really interesting to watch was Cory just be like, well, I'm vegan. No, I don't eat that. I don't eat that. And so he was eating some of the sides and stuff. But, and there were some people who were like, wait, you're what? I mean, we're talking 2016. Veganism was not as prevalent as it is now. But he was able to roll with that because he's so earnest. And he was able to stand there in that room and say, yeah, I'm vegan, so I can't eat that, and not have anybody. And if you're not from the Midwest or the South, maybe this comment won't make sense to you, but if you are, it will make perfect sense. And not have anybody feel judged by his not eating the food that they were eating, not eating red meat, that kind of thing. And nobody felt that way, because in one-on-one interactions with Cory, it's very different than the way he comes across on TV. His earnestness and his sincerity, there's no instinct in you to be skeptical of it. And so he's immensely talented and a great person, is my point. And the reason I think that maybe when Cory ran for president in the past and it didn't catch on, and where if he were to do so again, where I think it might, is because we live in a different media environment now. If you think about when Cory was running in the past, or in the period when he might run, right? When he was like giving the keynote at the Democratic convention in 16, with the idea being that, Obama had a similar speaking slot. What people were doing at that time was they were putting Cory in a box and measuring him against being in that box. So, which is to say, he was a young, really enthusiastic, and really thoughtful Black politician. And he was doing this, and he came of age, really came to our attention in the second term of Obama, which meant everybody was just like, is this guy like Obama? And Cory is not like Obama. I'm not saying he's lesser than. I'm saying he's a very different politician. And so when Cory, he gives great speeches, but his speeches are different than Obama's. Cory's style is, in my mind, a little more like on the Bill Clinton end of the spectrum, whereas Obama gives oration or oratory and speeches, and they sound like music. Cory is on that other very talented end of that spectrum, where Cory gives talks. Cory gets up and he tells you what he's thinking, and and just like this speech, and he channels people's emotions, and it's very raw. But in that moment in the Democratic Party, that's not what people were looking for from him, and so he didn't have the success that maybe he should have. And now I think we're in a very different time in the age of social media, where you don't get a packaged version of a candidate and you don't see them through a single lens. You really get full access to that person. I think this might really be Cory's time. And I think his instinct on this filibuster, some of his instincts on social media might really lend themselves to that. And then before we go to a break, I wanted to just briefly take this moment to talk about the filibuster, because we have thought about the filibuster over the last several years in terms of it being something that stops judges from being able to go in, from being able to get a vote, like with Merrick Garland. We think about it as something that kept Obamacare from being dismantled. But what we don't think about is it being an actual filibuster. The times where it has been an actual speaking, standing on your feet, hold the floor filibuster in recent history have been this speech by Cory, which was really just about trying to draw everyone's attention to something, and Ted Cruz filibustering Obamacare. And you could argue, and I don't mean this in a critical way, you could argue that both of those were symbolic, and you could even argue, that they were performative in a way. I miss the time when a filibuster was real, where you couldn't just say, well, you don't have 60 votes on that, so we assert the right of filibuster, and as a result, it's not going to happen. I am nostalgic for the time where a filibuster meant somebody or a group of people, a party, had to stand on their feet and they had to stop everything. And the reason I think that was so valuable is not just because I think it meant you earned it more. It's because if you wanted to keep, let's say you go back in time, if Mitch McConnell wanted to keep Merrick Garland off the court, it wasn't, as far as popular opinion went, just a matter of asking people whether they were okay with that justice being kept off the court. It would be, are you okay with the fact that the Republicans are so desperate to keep Obama from being able to have a Supreme Court justice that the Senate's doing nothing else? And that forces you to make political choices, and it forces the will of the people into the equation much more, to where they're not simply measuring whether they agree with you in a vacuum or whether it affects their life, because it will affect their life. Because if the Senate can do no other business while you are trying to preclude something from moving forward, then your desire to stop something from happening gets measured against the popularity of anything else that people do want to have happen, or the business of the Senate that is supposed to take place. That's how, for instance, in the Missouri State Senate, a filibuster still works. And we've had a lot of debates back and forth over the last few years about whether we, once we get power again, or when we had power, should have gotten rid of the filibuster. And I would just suggest that the next time we're in that position, we should say, well, what we should do is we should bring back the actual filibuster. And by the way, since this show is about how you can persuade the people in your life to come to your side of the aisle, that is kind of a nice and very reasonable and realistic middle ground that I think would be a credibility enhancing position for you to take with friends in your life. So when things like the filibuster come up, if you were to say, look, I think what the Democrats ought to do is to just bring back the real filibuster, the way it used to work. And this sort of reminded me of that. So we're going to take a break. And I'm, in addition to doing this show live and by myself, I'm going to now do the first ad of the break live. And then after the ad break, we'll come back. We're going to talk about the deportation scandal and this trolling thing where Trump is trying to get us convinced that he wants to go after a third term and actually could. So, all right, let's go to the break. You all know how important sleep is to me. It's why I'm obsessed with my Helix mattress. With everything that's going on in life, from work to a demanding social schedule to sports and kids, it's incredibly important to me that I'm getting a good night of sleep every night. My wife can attest. We've had our Helix mattress for over 2 years now. Our sleep quality has improved tremendously. Our good friend Jesse just got a Helix mattress on the recommendation of this show, and used the deal that I'll get to in the call to action. And she has been each morning waking up and texting us like live updates every day of like how much better her back feels each morning as a result. So the Helix lineup offers 20 unique mattresses, including the award-winning Luxe collection, the newly released Helix Elite collection, a mattress designed for big and tall sleepers, even a mattress made just for kids. So how are you going to know which Helix mattress works best for you and your body? You take the Helix Sleep Quiz, you find your perfect mattress in under 2 minutes, and your personalized mattress is shipped straight to your door free of charge. Helix knows that there's no better way to test out a new mattress than by sleeping on it in your own home. That's why they offer a 100-night trial and a 10 to 15-year warranty to try out your new Helix mattress. Helix has also been awarded the #1 mattress as picked by GQ and Wired Magazine. It's even recommended by multiple leading chiropractors and doctors of sleep medicine as a go-to solution for improving your sleep. Helix is offering 20% off site-wide. If you go to helixsleep.com/majority, like Jesse did, that's helixsleep.com/majority. This is their best offer yet, and it won't last long. With Helix, better sleep starts now. Typical children's vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk growing kids should never eat. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, super-powered, chewable vitamin. While most children's vitamins are filled with 5 grams of sugar and can contribute to a variety of health issues, Hiya is made with 0 sugar and 0 gummy junk, yet it tastes great and it's perfect for picky eaters, i.e. kids. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste that they love. Formulated with the help of nutritional experts, Hiya is pressed with a blend of 12 organic fruits and veggies, then supercharged with 15 essential vitamins and minerals, including vitamin D, B12, C, zinc, folate, and many others to help support immunity, energy, brain function, mood, concentration, teeth, bones, and more. It's non-GMO, vegan, dairy-free, allergy-free, gelatin-free, nut-free, and everything else that you can imagine. Hiya is designed for kids of all ages and sent straight to your door so parents have one less thing to worry about. As you know, I'm a father and I'm always on the lookout for the best possible vitamins for my child to take. I'm so happy that I've come across Hiya Health. The ingredients are amazing and I don't have to worry about sugar or gummy junk because Hiya Health is made without that stuff and is still able to keep the great taste, which is super important because that's how you get kids to eat it. We've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you must go to hiyahealth.com/majority. This deal is not available on the regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/majority and get your kids the full body nourishment that they need to grow into healthy adults. All right. Every week there is another deportation scandal, sometimes several times a week. And they make me sad, and they probably make you sad as well. But we shouldn't turn away from them. That doesn't mean you have to consume every piece of news, which is bad for your mental health, but we shouldn't turn away from them. And I want to highlight this one. Kilmar Abrego Garcia came to the United States in 2011. He lived in Maryland with his wife and 5-year-old child who is autistic and intellectually disabled. He worked a full-time job and was a legal resident of the United States. Again, he was a legal resident of the United States. And thanks to a 2019 court order, he could not be sent back to El Salvador, his country of origin. Garcia was also recently apprehended by the Trump administration and put on a plane to El Salvador without due process to be held behind bars. This week, in a court filing, administration officials conceded that his deportation was the result of a, quote, administrative error. It was against this backdrop that J.D. Vance decided to add some related thoughts to the public conversation, which did not go especially well for the vice president. NBC News reported that Vice President J.D. Vance weighed into the case and falsely said on X Tuesday that Garcia was a, quote, convicted MS-13 gang member. Garcia, by the way, has no criminal convictions in the U.S. or in El Salvador. His legal team said this in the lawsuit, and in a follow-up post on X Tuesday, Vance stood by his comments and called Garcia an illegal immigrant with no right to be in our country. This despite the 2019 protection order against his removal from the U.S., meaning a court had said none of that crap was true. And JD Vance is just like, I'm just going to keep saying it. So even for a vice president who routinely struggles with factual details, which is a nice way of saying lies all the time, or at least doesn't care about the facts and then just sticks with them after he gets them wrong. Even for that, this was a mess. So initially, Vance, by way of social media, took aim at a journalist who had fact-checked him and said that Garcia was a convicted gang member, which wasn't true and which was not supported by the administration's own court filing, which had conceded that that was not true. So Vance then tried again in a follow-up tweet, claiming that a journalist had been, quote, apparently unable or unwilling to look at the facts here. Vice President not only doubled down on his dubious claim, for which there does not appear to be any evidence, he also suggested that the Biden administration was in office in 2019. So, according to NPR, the government's filing was pretty shocking because they admitted everything that the defense alleged. Like, they were like, yeah, you're right. We got this wrong, right? Now, Justice Department lawyers acknowledged the mistake in Abrego Garcia's case. They say there is nothing federal officials can do because he's now in custody of another country. So they're basically acting like, well, what do you want to? They're acting as if this guy who had originally come here from El Salvador, had no criminal record in the other place, was legally living in the United States. They're acting as if what happened was he like visited El Salvador and got picked up by police and thrown into prison. What are they to do about it? Never mind the fact that law enforcement, federal law enforcement in this country, arrested him and flew him to that country. And now they're like, we shouldn't have done that. That was a mistake. But they're acting like, well, you know, he's in El Salvador. What do you want us to do about it? He's in this whole other country. There's nothing we can do. White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt on Tuesday doubled down on his deportation, pointing to his links, supposedly to MS-13, which Abrego Garcia's lawyers dispute, and there seems to be no evidence of whatsoever. And the latest case adds to the growing judicial scrutiny about the deportations, has even prompted, and this is where we get to the part where you may feel a little better, some consternation from one of Trump's allies, Joe Rogan, the Joe Rogan experience, and who, by the way, reminder, endorsed Trump last year. He raised concerns about it and generally about a lot of the El Salvador deportation. So here, let's go to this clip of Joe Rogan.
So there's still people coming through.
Yeah.
And there's probably still people coming through that are criminals.
Yeah.
You know, but the thing is, like, you got to get scared that people who are not criminals are getting, like, lassoed up and deported and sent to, like, El Salvador prisons, like that kind of shit. Because I read some story. It was a Glenn Greenwald.
It was. Yeah. The gay barber guy.
Yeah.
It's scary, man.
Is that true? Is that story accurate?
I don't think we know.
Can you explain the story for people that don't know?
Well, from what I read, I think it was in Time magazine, Jamie. If you can pull it up, and maybe we can get it accurate. But basically, with a bunch of these Agua guys, allegedly they got at least one guy who wasn't a criminal, who was just a gay barber who I think, according to the story, came here legally. He was here legally. That's what they said. Don't know if it's true.
Did he have a green card?
I don't know what the details are. Maybe Jamie can find it.
No criminal record.
From what it said in that story. Now, this is the problem, right? Because the mainstream media has been putting out so much shit that I don't know what to believe anymore, right?
I feel the same way.
And so it's difficult, but it's something that we actually brought up in one of our conversations. We interviewed the guy from the Heritage Foundation. We brought this up because I think we talked about this with Doge as well. When you do things quickly and you do things aggressively, that's how you get shit done. But that's also when mistakes get made.
Right.
And I think a human being being plucked out of nowhere and ending up in a country he's never been in a maximum security prison with gang members, seems like a bad thing to happen to me.
It's horrific. It's horrific.
I don't think that should be controversial.
No, that's not controversial at all. And this is the thing, measured twice, cut once. This is kind of crazy that could be possible. That's horrific. And that's bad for the cause. Like, the cause is, let's get the gang members out. Everybody agrees. But let's not innocent gay hairdressers get lumped up with the gang.
Okay, here's why I played that for you. When you talk about this issue with people in your life and the deportations and the immigration policy of Trump, I think we can learn a lot from the civil rights movement. And here's how, and it's really important how. When you look back at that moment in time, and you look back at the people who were going down to the South and were, marching with Dr. King and others, think about what they were doing. They were trying to bring attention to the plight of Black Americans throughout the country, but particularly in the South. And what they were confronting, like when we learn about this in school and when we think about it, we get the sanitized version that makes it seem like, well, what happened was Martin Luther King came along and he was just such a good speaker and such a dynamic person that he convinced us and healed our hearts. And that is not what happened. Okay. What happened was the reason that there had to be a movement is because the majority of the country was pretty ambivalent about the plight of African Americans in the South. And that is to say, including in the North, people were ambivalent. Okay. It's not like, you know, if you're third generation, you know, New York City, don't lean back and be like, well, you know, my family, we've always been right on this. No, probably your family was like, well, you know, like they may not have said it out loud. They didn't care that much about it. Maybe they had an opinion. Maybe they weren't, you know, maybe they were voting more for civil rights, but it didn't affect them. They weren't thinking about it that much. And like, go back and watch any movie from the, I don't know, 80s or earlier, and every bad guy is Black. Okay. Everything that was portrayed to us all the way going into the 90s, frankly, every fictional character, every time we saw Black people on television as Americans, they were portrayed as scary and bad. Okay. So it's still the case too often, but either way, like, it was pervasive. And that's what a lot of white Americans thought about Black people. Okay. And it's what people think about immigrants too often right now, right? They're afraid of them. And what that means is that if all people had done during the civil rights movement, if all Dr. King had done, and every freedom rider, and if all they had done was said, this isn't fair, it would not have worked. Okay. Because there just weren't enough people that saw the humanity of the average African American living under Jim Crow, or could relate to it in a real way. So what did the civil rights movement do politically that was so ingenious? Is they highlighted the worst and most egregious behavior by people like Bull Connor and George Wallace and folks like that. And why did they peacefully march across the Pettus Bridge? Why did they allow themselves to be hit with fire hoses and had dogs? I mean, allow themselves. They didn't have a choice. But why was it important that the footage of dogs being sicked on them happened? Because it was so egregious that it subsumed the ambivalence and overwhelmed the ambivalence that most white Americans had in the North and throughout the rest of the country at that point. It forced you to see their humanity. So what I'm saying is that if you want to take a lesson, and we should, from the civil rights movement in the way that we push back against these deportations, it is not in trying to make an argument like, you know, these people are, you know, they're just working very hard, and I believe all those things, and you believe all those things. But if you have somebody who is truly in favor, or at least leans toward being in favor of Trump's immigration policies, what you have to do is you have to highlight as much as possible the most egregious stuff. And we have to highlight them over and over again. And we have to have these details, these stories penetrate the news cycle, and they have to come through in your conversations with people in your lives. Because that's why somebody like Joe Rogan sits there. Now you'll notice he's saying, I still think we should get rid of a lot of these people, but he's saying this is wrong. And at some point, when people see how many of these truly innocent people who are family members, when those stories become real, it will subsume people's prejudice in many cases. And it will get to their heart, which is where this has to be. And so I would encourage you to model the strategy of the civil rights movement. What I would not tell you to do is reference the civil rights movement in these conversations, because people will not see it as the same. You cannot you're not going to win over somebody who is, you know, leans toward Trump or is open to, you know, supporting Republicans right now by telling them that this is the same as, you know, the Martin Luther King, who they learned about in school. They're not going to get there. And so you've got to do what Martin Luther King did, and you've got to highlight the humanity here and use these actual stories and bring them to life. It's the only way to be successful in doing this. Now, last year, let's talk about Trump's latest troll job to try and distract us from other things that are in the news, where he starts talking about a third term. Now, part of the story, according to the Wall Street Journal, is that his attorney, I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name, Boris Epstein, maybe, made a bold assertion during a meeting in late 2023 that Trump wouldn't necessarily be limited to 2 terms in office. Speaking to an associate in October 23 in downtown Washington, Epstein pushed back on the notion that Trump would be a lame duck if he won the election in 2024. He said he had studied the law and he believed Trump could find a way to run again in 2028, according to the person that he met with. At the time, the associate thought the comments were amusing, even if he was serious, right? But they recounted them to others in Washington, joking that Epstein had already started planning a third term even before Trump had won the 2024 Republican primary. But 18 months later, the person looks back on the conversation with alarm as Trump openly toys with remaining in office after his term ends. Trump said this weekend that he was, quote, not joking about staying in office after his current term ends in January 2029, jumpstarting a long simmering Washington debate over just how serious he is about seeking a third term. The president, in an interview with NBC News, pointed to unnamed, quote, methods for clinching another 4 years in office. Trump would be 82 at the end of his second term. Since first winning the presidency in 2016, Trump has been musing, kidding, flirting, and otherwise raising the issue of remaining in office beyond 2 terms. The casual style the president uses to broach a serious topic has turned the idea into a Trump-shaped Rorschach test. Those who fear and dislike him see bright red flashing warning lights, and many who adore him shrug it off or laugh along, saying, oh, look there, he's upsetting all you lefties again, and he doesn't mean it. So some of his advisors dismiss critics' concerns about the president's remarks. He's joking, they say. He's trolling the media and liberals. Others close to the president contend he's shifting attention away from the revelation that his national security advisor included a journalist on a group text chat in which senior officials discussed a sensitive military strike. Trump recently told the friend that he made such comments to, quote, make the media crazy, and the friend recalled this to the Wall Street Journal. But some senior Republicans privately said that they take Trump at his word. They're finally starting to figure out that he's not actually that funny, so he doesn't actually joke that much. And they believe he could try to remain in office. And in interviews, they noted that law firms, universities, corporations, and lawmakers have marshaled little resistance to the president's policies so far in his second term. And they said efforts to stop him could become more difficult in the coming years if he continues to amass power. By the way, anytime I read that some senior Republicans privately said anything that ends in there are concerns that efforts to stop him could become more difficult in the coming years if he continues to amass power, I'm reminded that those jerks are doing nothing to stop those efforts to amass power. And they're like, we're starting to get worried that our doing absolutely nothing to stop the bad guys could result in the bad guys winning. Well, so thanks for your help. But all right. A lot of people wrote to me this week really worried about this. So I want to talk about this. First, let's talk about why this is not going to happen. The Constitution's actually pretty clear on this. And now I know that doesn't always matter because the Supreme Court could decide, let's let the guy stay in office. But the conservatives on the court, we've stopped, Robbie United says, stop calling them conservatives. The Republicans on the court, because that's more accurate, are politicians. And therefore they respond to incentives the way other politicians do. They are partisan Republicans. What they are not, at least not all of them, are just Trump acolytes. Okay? So what that means is you have to look at their cost and reward system here. There are going to be, if Trump is trying to run again, there are going to be people in their circle, in their Republican circle, who privately don't want that. I mean, they don't want that. None of them wanted him to run this time, right? But they're not going to want that. J.D. Vance would like to run for president. So would a bunch of other people, right? A bunch of other people would like to be vice president. They'd like, a shot at the cabinet. This is kind of like, Little League. They want their playing time. And the reward system for those folks is going to be like that. It's not going to do them any good to side with Trump in something crazy like this because there's no reward for them in it. They're not going to be buttering the Republican bread by doing so. So I think it's very unlikely that they were to get away with something like this. Now, if somehow I'm wrong about that and he can run again, I'll tell you why you shouldn't worry about that. First of all, it is very difficult to see actual jurisprudence that gets you to a place where Trump can run again, but Obama can't. And I just don't think Donald Trump wants any piece of that. I'm not saying Obama would run, and I'm also not saying that Obama would be the best candidate for us to field. But Trump doesn't want that. He doesn't want that at all. And on top of that, he will be 82 years old, and he will be at the end of a period of time where he will have been, heck, if you go back to the apprentice years, in our life for an exhaustive period of time. And Americans don't have that kind of attention span. You know, even if you just look at his political years, he's going to wear on us by that point. And he's definitely not going to be the strongest possible Republican candidate if he were to try and run for a third term. Now, I know what you're thinking right now. What you're thinking is, well, that is because I see this all over my social media when I say stuff like this. That is naive of you and adorable that you think that he means to do it via an election. I know a lot of you are thinking, well, we're not even going to have elections in 2028. We are going to have an election in 2028. Elections are decentrally done in this country. They're not run by the federal government. And each state has on its books, presidential elections happening is not because of a federal law. They are done via state law and via state election officials. So he can try to stay in office all he wants, but don't think for a moment that there's not going to be a presidential elections held in this country. They will be state by state, county by county, election authority by election authority. They will be held. And it is, I think, a very tall, way out there order to say that the Supreme Court is going to ignore the fact that an election was held. They're just not going to do that. They're not going to say that the primary elections when Trump is running to try and get the nomination again, that they didn't count. They're not going to say that states that held elections, that those were invalid and didn't count. Now you're thinking, well, what if he invokes martial law? Okay, just know that there's really no legal avenue to do that. So if that's what you're worried about, then you need to recognize that I don't know why you're listening to this or watching this anyway, because in your mind, the fight is completely over. All right. And I think you're listening to this or you're watching this because you don't believe the fight is completely over. And if you don't believe the fight is completely over, then you don't believe that a president in this country can just simply wave his hand and say, we're not going to have elections anymore. I'm not saying that could never happen in this country. I'm saying that it would be extremely difficult and it would take more time than Trump has to put in place the sort of infrastructure around him for that to happen. And so I do not believe that is going to happen. And by the way, if that is going to happen, you can't do anything about it. So what choice do you have, right? If that were real, like I was in the airport heading to St. Louis for this thing with Ravi, and some people recognized me and stopped me, and they asked me how I feel about, they said that they're very worried about their grandkids growing up in the country right now, and they asked me how I feel about, my kids growing up. And I said, well, I'm worried about the future for my kids. But yeah, I'm optimistic. And they said, why? And I said, well, what choice do I have? I'm not leaving America. I'm not going to leave the country. So what would be the point of pessimism? What would be the point about worrying about things I can't control? So look, there will be an election in 2028. Donald Trump will not be the Republican candidate. And if somehow I'm wrong about that second thing, I think that's really bad news for the Republicans because they will be running an overexposed, probably by that time, pretty unpopular 82-year-old Donald Trump. I don't think that bodes well for them. And so that's how I see it. That's how I think things are going to go. Thank you all for listening to this filibuster of a podcast. As a reminder, we have the new show on Valor Media Network, The Game Within, where we talk about the politics of sports, and it's actually really fun. I'm having a lot of fun doing it with Ravi and Adisu, and it streams live at 1:00 on Tuesdays, and then it drops on audio on Tuesday evening. So please find The Game Within wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe. A reminder, you can get Ravi's book, which is fantastic and doing extremely well. It's called Garbage Town, and it's you can get it at garbagetownbook.com. You can find it all the places you can get it. Of course, you can also get it wherever you get your books. Thank you to everybody again who came out to see us in St. Louis. Ravi and I haven't done a live event together. I think since I think we did one in Austin like a couple of years ago, and then before that we did one in Kansas City in 2021. Um, and uh, and and we were just talking afterwards about how energizing it was, because there were a bunch of you. There was like we filled that place. There was like 100 of you there in that little bookstore. Um, and so many of you came up to us and talked to us afterwards about how much the show means to you. And it really was meaningful to us because, look, when we do this show, for Ravi, he does it from whatever desk he can find, wherever in the world he is at that moment. I walk upstairs here in my house and, I plug a couple of things in, and I turn on the live stream and I stare into this thing and I talk to you. And it's easy to lose touch with the idea that you're talking to somebody and they're listening to you. And so I just really appreciate everybody coming to us and telling us how much the show means to them, and how it's helped them maintain relationships with people in their family who didn't vote the way they did. And it's helped them, bring some people over to their side and given them hope. And I just really appreciate it. It was really energizing for Ravi and I, and it helped us sort of talk about afterwards about renewing our commitment to doing this. And so thank you. Also, since this is one for us, random thing. I was talking earlier about having been watching a bunch of movies from the 70s and 80s lately. On the flight to and from St. Louis, I watched Serpico, which I had never seen, the Al Pacino movie about Frank Serpico, the cop in New York City in the 70s who took on corruption and really put his life on the line to do so. And I'd never seen it. And, my dad was a police officer, and my dad had told me that movie was part of what inspired him to become a police officer. And it was wild to watch that movie. One, it's really great. And two, reading about the movie afterwards, you realize like how true it was, like how it's not just based on a true story. Like that's what happened in Frank Serpico's life. And just the clothes Al Pacino wore in it, the way Al Pacino's character, Frank Serpico, the way he walked, the way he regarded the world, sort of Frank Serpico's idea of a moral code being something that wasn't that you arrive at for yourself and that you do not deviate from, and that you don't allow people to tell you that, a moral code is something that you get from other people telling you what's okay and what's not. It was like seeing a prequel to my dad's life, and it was really cool to watch. And my dad is 71, and I got to talk to him about the movie afterwards, and I told him that it really helped me see how my dad arrived in a lot of ways, or how my dad already saw the world, but his philosophy of things and what he and my mom instilled in myself and my brothers, and it made me think about the times in my life where a lot of people, to a much lesser extent than what Serpico dealt with, but a lot of people were telling me why I shouldn't cling to certain ideas. And it made me think, for instance, about when I got to the state legislature I got elected in 08 and got there in 09. And I had just come from, doing anti-corruption investigations as an intelligence officer in Afghanistan. And then I got there and I found that I was really discouraged to see how much, not as violent by any means, but how much corruption there actually was in the state legislature. I'd been very idealistic going into it. And so I kept filing these bills on ethics reform and campaign reform and lobbying reform. And I refused to accept gifts from lobbyists because there was no limit on gifts back then. And people didn't like that. The Democrats on paper shared my view from a policy perspective on campaign reform. But, a lot of members of the legislature were coming up to me and saying like, hey man, why, you're grandstanding. Why are you doing this? And people would say things, people who I liked, good people would say things like, look, they don't pay us very much. The fact that we can go get a free dinner on a lobbyist, that's part of the compensation. It's part, otherwise who would do this job? And look, I was in a position where I was fortunate. Like I had a job as an attorney and my wife did. So I try very hard not to judge the people I was with. Just as Serpico was not judging the other cops. He was judging the system. but I had made the choice for me that I'm not going to take those things. And ultimately, I was, after a lot of fighting, myself and others were successful in getting lobbyist gifts to the point where it was like you can only give like $10, and it all changed a lot. But I was just thinking about how many people came up to me and said, "Look, we agree with you, but you don't need to do that. You're still a very moral person. You're still on the right side of things. If you just eat this dinner, if you let this person take you to this ball game and you don't pay for it." And it just was interesting. I thought about how I arrived at being the person who would do that. And I think it came from my parents. And it was just interesting to watch the movie and to read all about Frank Serpico afterwards, and how at every turn they were just like, look, just take this money. And it's, you're making it difficult for the rest of us by not. And he risked his life and was deeply uncomfortable. And so it was just really interesting to watch. So this is me, what, over 50 years since that movie came out, which was like 8 years before my birth, saying, "Hey, this movie Serpico is good. You should think about getting it. About watching it on Amazon. I highly recommend it. It's getting a lot of buzz." Anyway, thank you for listening to this. I enjoyed doing it. I enjoy it much more when Ravi is here, and I'm sure he'll be back soon. And so you won't have to put up with this all the time. Thanks for making it this far. You can find me at Jason Kander everywhere. Again, garbagetownbook.com is Ravi's book, and it is truly excellent, and you should get it. Please leave a 5-star review. Feel free to leave a review letting me know whether you completely hated this or not. Me doing this by myself. Thank you to the Midas Mighty. And remember, we all have a platform. Make sure to use yours today.